world's greatest city rights in flames an epic of courage that stirs the hearts of free men everywhere.
The Blitz in 1941. German bombs rained down on Britain, causing hundreds of casualties every night, and Westminster did not escape the general destruction. On the night of May the 10th, the chamber of the House of Commons, the epicentre of British democracy, was utterly destroyed.
There was nothing left of the interior. The Speaker's chair had gone and all the benches, and even the dispatch boxes couldn't be saved.
Amidst all the human and physical damage, this was a symbolic blow to Britain. The Victorian Chamber of the Commons was the scene of generations of democratic debate, the stage for Gladstone and Disraeli, Asquith and Baldwin. But Parliament was an obvious target. It had already been hit before, in September 1940.
Then came the deliberate attempt to burn the city of London to the ground by viciously calculated arson. Never since the Great Fire of 1666 has such a roaring furnace swept through our capital.
The Blitz was 9 months of continuous German air raids over Britain, with London the major target. Sirens, explosions, shattered buildings and civilian casualties were everyday facts of life, and huge tracts of London were destroyed or damaged, including well-loved landmarks.
Nothing was sacred. The great Cathedral of St. Paul's was grievously damaged.
The survival of St. Paul's Cathedral, when all around was bombed, became a symbol of national resilience. The Houses of Parliament were not immune. A high-explosive bomb did the first serious damage in September 1940, when the statue of King Richard the Lionheart was seen to jump from its pedestal as the blast hit, only to land back in its place more or less unscathed, except that the King's sword was bent. Parliament was an obvious target, and the Palace of Westminster set up its own branch of the ARP, Air Raid Precautions, to protect itself, with even Lords and MPs expected to serve.
A fire-watching system was begun, and every able-bodied person on the premises, including the MPs, very much so, was expected to do his turn in fire watching. And when the Home Guard was set up in May 1940, almost immediately the Palace of Westminster Home Guard was formed. They actually manned an anti-aircraft gun by the exit to Westminster Tube Station. And they also provided a guard of honour for the wartime state openings.
The Houses of Parliament had already suffered some bomb damage, but on the night of May the 10th, 1941, the very height of the Blitz, with 500 German bombers attacking London, the Luftwaffe scored a direct and very symbolic hit on the heart of British democracy. More than 1,000 Londoners were killed by the bombs that night. 2,000 fires were started, including the one which consumed the elaborate high Gothic setting the Victorians had constructed for the House of Commons. It was destroyed by blast and fire. Almost nothing recognisable remained inside the scorched walls, although the rooms around were almost untouched.
The Commons chamber was hit by incendiaries, first of all, and then a blast bomb, a very high explosive bomb, finished it off. The southeast side of Westminster Hall was set on fire, and also at the Lord's End, a tower fell into the Royal Gallery, and 2 police auxiliaries were killed. They were fire watching at that point. It was hit about 12 times altogether, in fact, and did a lot of damage.
This place, the Chamber of the House of Commons, seems embedded in British history. It's the stage on which political titans from Gladstone to Blair faced their opponents in mostly peaceful debate. But the chamber we see today is only 60 years old, despite its familiar shape, its familiar configuration.
It was more elaborate than we see the chamber today, because the detail was by Augustus Welby Pugin, who was a devout Gothic revivalist. And so the oak panelling and the stained glass was just a bit more elaborate than we have it today.
The destruction was a painful sight for those who had made their career there, and none more so than Winston Churchill, who'd spent the best part of 40 years as an MP. He came to inspect the wreckage, as did Howard Marshall of the BBC Home Service, who described the scene to listeners.
I'm speaking in the ruins of the House of Commons, and ruins they are indeed. I'm standing in one of the lobbies, with water dripping onto me from the charred rafters above, looking over what was the actual chamber, where all the great debates took place, where only the other day Mr. Winston Churchill was triumphantly winning his vote of confidence. And what I've just seen in that chamber is a man groping down among grotesquely twisted girders and huge chunks of masonry, a man searching with a torch for any sign of the Speaker's chair or the famous dispatch boxes.
Another appalled witness was the diarist, socialite and MP, Chips Channon.
I tried to get to the House of Commons, but the crowd was so large I could not fight my way through. But I could see the huge hole in the Westminster Hall roof. I met Jim Thomas, who tells me the chamber is gutted. No more shall we hear fiery and futile speeches there. Gone is that place, as I always foresaw. Itself the cradle, the protector of democracy. In the end, it went a long way to kill what it created.
That there was anything left of Westminster Hall, the cavernous medieval hall around which the Houses of Parliament are clustered, was because of an MP, Colonel Walter Elliot. He decided to let the chamber burn so the hall could be saved.
Nobody had noticed that Westminster Hall was on fire. So he broke in through the north doors using an axe because people couldn't find their way to the key to get in. And he directed the operations so that by the end of the evening they were almost knee-deep in water from the firemen's hoses.
And on BBC Radio's The Week in Westminster, Gordon MacDonald MP described Parliament's phlegmatic response.
Many members of Parliament, after gazing at the heap of bricks and twisted steel which a week ago was the House of Commons, confessed to feeling sick at heart. Whatever the dislocation or inconvenience enemy action may have caused in the vicinity of Westminster, it has failed, and failed entirely to interrupt parliamentary proceedings.
It turned out not to be a shattering blow to national morale. Far from being devastated at the destruction of its traditional home, British politics kept calm and carried on. In fact, Parliament was well prepared for the blow to fall. Several alternative venues had been scouted out, including nearby Church House, the headquarters of the Church of England, where there were debating chambers for its synod, and venues even further afield.
I think as the clouds of war gathered, they thought that it would be quite a good idea to think of somewhere well away from London that the House could go. And they settled on Stratford, where the House was to occupy the theatre, and you might think that there's some resonances about that. And indeed, there were clerks of the House who were sent off to Stratford to trudge up and down the roads. They'd been given a list of houses, and they wanted to find out whether they'd be suitable to billet members of Parliament in. And when war actually came, Winston Churchill wrote to the Secretary of the Cabinet, Sir Edward Bridges, and said that he thought it would be a good idea to find alternative accommodation. And the alternative accommodation which they chose was Church House. It was thought that the strength of the building was very much greater than the Palace of Westminster, which of course everybody saw as being a target, and occupying 9 acres in the centre of London might have been thought to be quite a difficult target to miss as well.
Even Church House was not without its difficulties.
In November 1940, when the state opening took place there, the King and Queen, instead of being able to advance in stately fashion through the doors of Convocation Hall, had to sort of shimmy through with the King in front and the Queen behind, but still hand in hand. And there wasn't room for many people for that state opening. But there was another problem too, which when you have the two chambers, as it were, connected just with a corridor and a line of sight, when Black Rod goes to summon the Commons, it's very straightforward, and Black Rod simply sets out, and there's no possibility of navigational error. Church House is rather more of a problem, and on this occasion, when Black Rod was sent off to summon the Commons, he lost his way completely. Every time he went up to a policeman, he was met with a great shout of, "Make way for Black Rod!" So he wasn't actually able to engage anybody in conversation as to where he should go. And eventually, after a couple of circuits, I should think it must have been, of the outer ring of Church House, he found his way to the Commons. And there was the door, and it had a heavy velvet curtain in front of it. And he raised his black rod to strike 3 times on the door. And at that point, a highly vigilant Commons doorkeeper, as they always are even today, grabbed his arm, and as he drew back the curtain, Black Rod saw that actually beyond the curtain was glass. And had he gone ahead and done that, it would have been a pretty unusual arrival of Black Rod in the Commons to the sound of crashing glass, and a rather discomforted Black Rod, I think.
Even before the bombing, MPs had tried out Church House for size.
When they first went to Church House, they didn't actually know that they were going. And in May 1940, all the arrangements, the slightly experimental arrangements, but they had proper sittings, were all in place. And the first that members knew about it was when they were redirected by the police when they arrived at the Palace of Westminster. When they came back, A.P. Herbert, who was quite a mordant observer of what was going on, said that he thought that they were very glad to come back from Church House despite the risks, because they rather preferred the risk of bombs to the home of bishops.
The censor stop on the revealing story of the 80-day battle against the flying bomb having now been lifted, we can for the first time publish secret films photographed at the killing grounds in southern England.
But in the Blitz, nowhere in London was safe.
I can remember very well hearing one of those flying bombs suddenly cut out above my head when I was making a speech and being interrupted by Willie Gallagher. I said to my neighbour in an audible whisper, "It'd be a pity to end one's life like this, listening to Willie Gallagher."
MPs used several different venues, but mostly sat in the Chamber of the Lords, courteously vacated by peers.
We invited the House of Commons into our chamber and withdrew into the Queen's robing room. And that was a very small place. There was less room, but it made relations between the parties more friendly, because they were closer together.
The future Foreign Secretary, Lord Carrington, took his seat for the first time while they were still in those temporary quarters.
Well, this is what was the King's robing room, but where the House of Lords sat in 1945, because the House of Commons chamber had been bombed, and the House of Commons sat in the House of Lords, and the House of Lords was relegated to the King's robing room, which, as you can see, is not very big. But in those days, the House of Lords was pretty small, and it accommodated everybody without too much difficulty. You will see that over there, where the throne now is where the Lord Chancellor sat. And here on the right, you have the Labour benches, and here on the left, you have the Conservative benches.
And the future Prime Minister, James Callaghan, remembers the Commons sitting in St Stephen's Hall, once the site of its first dedicated chamber.
One remarkable thing about that was there were no benches. You know how crowded it is in the Commons. We've all seen it on television, everybody sitting on everybody else's lap. We all had separate individual chairs, and it made it much more stately. We're all much more on our best behaviour because we weren't sort of crowded elbow to shoulder, as it were, and the proceedings were very decorous at the time.
History's greatest drama is being performed in the London Theatre of War.
With much of London and other cities in ruins, rebuilding the chamber was not the first priority. MPs didn't want to put themselves ahead of homeless families. But they did set up a committee to draw up plans, and they held 2 major debates on what to do when the moment came. And that led to some profound thinking about how the physical arrangements of Parliament had shaped and would shape British democracy. as well as to a conscious decision not to remove every trace of the destruction. So, Mr. Speaker, here we are at the Churchill Arch, which is still showing all the signs of the damage that was done that day when the bomb fell. Yes. Why did they leave it like this?
Churchill felt very strongly that it should be preserved intact. You may recall, Mark, there were two great debates about the rebuilding of the chamber, the first in October 1943 and the second in January 1945. It was in that second debate that Churchill made an eloquent plea for the retention of the damaged arch. What he said on that occasion was very striking, and it sums it up extremely clearly. I hope very much that the archway into the chamber from the inner lobby, where the bar used to be, which was smitten by the blast of the explosion and has acquired an appearance of antiquity that might not have been achieved by the hand of time in centuries, will be preserved intact as a monument of the ordeal which Westminster has passed through in the Great War.
Another firm decision was to keep the Gothic style, although in an age of austerity it would be a pared-down version, not the high Victorian Gothic of the original.
Gothic wasn't as fashionable as it had been, say, 50 years previously, and some MPs thought that they should have a modernist interior, they should be more forward-looking. But it was argued by Churchill, amongst others, that they should stick to the traditions of the old Gothic style.
The problem is that at the time, of course, the Pugin type of Gothic was very much out of fashion. And you've only got to look at the reactions of various architectural historians, Nicholas Pevsner, for example, to see what they thought of that particular style in that context. And he was very condemnatory about this attempt to sort of have a half Gothic, a fake Gothic, in place of what had been there before. I think many people felt that things should have been done differently.
But above all, the Prime Minister was the leading voice urging the Commons to stick to its time-honoured configuration and not to shift to a European-style semicircle or hemicycle.
Churchill believed that the two-party system that he saw as the cornerstone of British democracy actually owed its existence to the opposing rows of benches and oblong shape of the Commons. And he famously contrasted the rectangular Commons with the semicircular parliaments of Europe, all of which, of course, had failed and sort of proved unequal to the task in the face of fascism and communism in the 1930s and 1940s. Churchill also believes that the intimacy of the Commons is extremely important. It's one of the smallest parliamentary chambers in the world. It can barely seat 2/3 of the members. And he says that this has had a very profound effect on the sort of style and tone of debate. He points to the many interruptions, to the genuine exchanges that take place between MPs. And again, he contrasts this with the European parliaments, with their formal seating arrangements and harangues from the rostrum, as he puts it.
And when the Commons voted on its plans, Churchill's phrase-making was decisive.
We shape our buildings, and afterwards our buildings shape us. And he felt that it was very important, first of all, that the chamber should be oblong, not semicircular. And in making this argument, he said words to the effect that, of course, there were nuances of opinion, differences of opinion, and changes of opinion. But in a parliamentary democracy, the party system had much to commend it, and the sense that you were on either the government side or the opposition side was frankly of the essence, and that if you wanted to shift from one side to the other, you shouldn't be able, as you could in a semicircular chamber, simply to morph into a different part of the chamber without clearly being on one side or the other. If you wanted to change sides, you should have to go the whole hog and cross the floor.
The very same arguments had been heard 100 years before, when the old Palace of Westminster had burned to the ground.
It is really significant, I think, on the two occasions when Parliament has been forced to address this issue, about how best to organise the sort of physical space at the centre of the representative system, it's done so against a background of national crisis and political uncertainty. Not everybody agreed with Churchill. One of the more notable critics was Nancy Astor, the first woman to sit as an MP. And she accused Churchill of looking backwards rather than forwards, and argued for having a circular chamber in which government and opposition didn't have to sit and stare at each other like dogs on a leash, as she put it. And she thought that a circular chamber would lead to a far less confrontational style of politics. It would be less adversarial, less sort of polarised. And above all, she thought it would connect far better with the sort of brave new world that everybody was hoping would emerge after the war.
Having decided not to break with the past, there was only one man for the job.
Giles Gilbert Scott was suggested by the Royal Institute of British Architects as the best architect for this work, because he came from a line of Gothic revivalists, and he himself had designed the Liverpool Anglican Cathedral when he was in his early 20s in a 20th century form of Gothic. So he knew well how to design in this style. But also he was associated with power stations. He designed Battersea Power Station. So he knew how to put in modern, convenient mechanical and electrical ventilation and heating as well.
He created a kind of austerity Gothic, more restrained than Pugin and Barry's Victorian original. Critics derided the result as neon Gothic.
Giles Gilbert Scott had to pare down some of the detailing. Also, it was into the modernist period of architecture, and so it was thought to be more appropriate for modern times to have a simpler version of the Gothic.
The result seems pretty similar, but there were important differences.
So what we've got here is the original plans for rebuilding the chamber. It looks pretty much the same at chamber level.
It does. This is a longitudinal section through, and you can see the same position of the speaker's chair, the clerk's table, even the angled sides to the roof, which Barry had introduced. But around the chamber, you can see much more accommodation was added. To get in more visitors, they cantilevered out the upper tier of galleries, creating a wider and longer upper part of the chamber than the lower part.
With almost no fixtures and fittings salvaged from the wreckage of 1941, the Commonwealth countries rallied round to furnish MPs' new home, including the Speaker's chair donated by Australia and carved from black bean wood from Queensland.
It was a gift to this country from Australia, a Commonwealth country, really for two reasons. First, it was a reflection of solidarity on the part of Commonwealth nations towards the Mother of Parliaments and the head of the Commonwealth. And secondly, it was a reflection also of the age of austerity through which Britain was passing in the late 1940s and the beginning of the 1950s.
Canada donated the table and New Zealand the dispatch boxes, key props in parliamentary theatre.
I think that these boxes add hugely to the significance of our chamber, and I think people value them very greatly. But they do also have a practical purpose aside from their use for speech making. Having the oath cards in here and the Bibles, the Old Testament, New Testament, is very important, and we would want to keep it that way.
The Houses of Parliament are united once again. White against the grey of history gleams the roof of the new chamber of the House of Commons.
9 long years after the bombing, years which saw the rest of the war and most of Clem Attlee's post-war government, the doors framed by the Churchill Arch were unlocked and the rebuilt chamber opened for business.
The Speaker of the House of Commons, Colonel Clifton Brown, enters as the High Court of Parliament assembles for the official opening of the new chamber. On the right, facing the thrones, sit the Commons, and on the left, the Lords.
Commons Chamber has been rebuilt after its destruction by Your Majesty's enemies in 1941 and is now ready for occupation.
After the Lord Chancellor, the King's speech.
True to its function of expressing the will and spirit of my people, the House of Commons continued with unshakable courage and high purpose to fulfill its duties despite the bombing of its home.
It quickly became clear the old spirit of Parliament was still present in the chamber. It was still unrivalled as a stage for political theatre.
No, no, no.
And I wish everyone, friend or foe, well, and that is that, the end.
Some members of our armed forces acted wrongly. The government is ultimately responsible for the conduct of the armed forces, and for that, on behalf of the government, indeed on behalf of our country, I am deeply sorry.
That Churchill quote, that we shape our buildings and our buildings shape us, still reverberates, because a decision not to reshape our buildings means that we don't reshape ourselves or our democracy either. That was a very important decision when they decided to keep the House of Commons in its current shape. It still leaves its mark on British democracy today.